district officers as well as the CM fellowships. I think it's a great and exciting opportunity. The question is that, and that's also something that we have highlighted in our policy education paper, is that, students come back and say, okay, I've done this fellowship from so-and-so place, but what should I do after that? So people at the younger days are doing fellowship hopping, right? They're moving from one fellowship to the other, not for any fault of theirs, but what is the prior and structured career option that is there for public policy. And that is something that we need to, very carefully think about. And that's also something that I am also talking to people in the policy space.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Policy Pod. Today, I have the distinct pleasure to be in conversation with Dr. Ajit Phadnis, an associate professor at IIM Indore. Professor Phadnis, born in Bangalore, did his bachelor's in engineering from IIT Bombay and soon after an MBA from IIM Bangalore. He started his career as a social sector consultant with PwC, post which he first worked with the parliament and then joined the academia, completing his PhD with particular interest in democracy, parliament, and state legislatures, and the interface between politics and public policy from IIM Bangalore. It's a pleasure to have you here with us, Professor Phadnis.
Thank you, Ayush. It's a pleasure to be here. And I would like to start by putting on record my deep appreciation for the wonderful work that you, Ayush, as well as Yash, are doing with Public Policy India. And glad to be part of one of your programs. Thank you.
Thank you. And Miss, I've given a very brief introduction of you, but why don't we start today with you telling us a little bit about your career and your career journey from an IIT and IIM product to working in a consulting firm to how it changed for you to enter the parliament for a Lok Sabha internship and then in the space of academia. How did all of that happen? What's your journey been like?
Yeah, so my career has been kind of broadly directed, but meandering. And every time I have kind of meandered across different directions, it has brought me some very interesting insights that have kind of strengthened me as we go further. So let's start from childhood. I was born in Bengaluru, had a large part of my schooling in Mumbai, and my I come from a middle class family. My father used to work with the Tatas, and being from a middle class family, one of the main ways of some kind of economic upliftment came through education. And so, from my early days, the ambition was to study in one of the top universities in the country. And the three words IIT always stuck with me. And so that kind of motivated a large part of my education. And so I was very happy to get a good rank and secure an electrical engineering berth at IIT Bombay, one of the really, life-changing experiences for me. And of course, but once you go into the institute, right, of course, engineering was an important element. I did decently in engineering. But I was also involved in a large number of other activities at the institute, and particularly with organizing and administrative work that I was very actively involved in. And this, of course, carried on during my IIM days as well. And while, of course, I, continue to kind of pursue what looks like a dream trajectory. And so at IIM, I had this very revealing conversation with one of my faculty there. And so that's very important, right? So sometimes our conversations with some faculty have a lot of life changing kind of effects on us. And so I remember this conversation that I had with this faculty in the lounge, in the student lounge. And this was the time when I just completed my summers. And this was the summers with an investment bank, and we were anticipating that the investment bank would also give an offer called the pre-placement interview, which would of course directly put you on board for serious consideration for a job opportunity. And so I was at this coffee table, and this faculty was just across on the other side of the table, and we were conversing on careers and things like that. And he asked me one question. So tell me, Ajit, what is it that will give you more happiness? Would it be 1 crore in your bank account, or would it be the fact that you helped 1 crore people? Right. And so for me, the answer kind of came very reactively. And I said, yes, I would probably be happy by helping 1 crore more people. So then he said that, well, then your goals are well laid out. You only need to, go forward and find the path to achieve the goals. And so for every person, there's an inflection point in their life. And for me, that was a very important inflection point. And so I knew what to do after that, right? In my final placements, I appeared for jobs only for companies that, had public policy related roles. And I was extremely happy to be recruited by a policy consulting firm that was PricewaterhouseCoopers and things like that. So I had the fortune of working with PricewaterhouseCoopers for about 1.5 years, close to 2 years actually. And then when I was working on a particular project on education with PwC, and I saw this advertisement which came on when I was doing one of the searches, and this was this very interesting Parliament fellowship. And so this was a program instituted by the then Speaker of the Lok Sabha, Somnath Chatterjee. And so he selected five fellows from across the country, and I was very happy to be recruited for one of that. So that of course gave me another kind of a change, in kind of a maneuver in my career, where from moving to a private organization which worked with the government, I then started kind of seeing how the internal functioning of the government works, of course by being a research fellow with the government. And the Parliament experience of course was very interesting for me, because, and of course, the first time you go to the gates of the Parliament, right, it sends shivers down the spine, right? The very majesty of the institution, right? Whether it's the old Parliament building or the new Parliament building. And of course, over this period of 1 year, a great love for the institution that we have. And that was when I determined that I will go back and probably work on in my in take a kind of a job which will help me focus primarily on the work of the Parliament. And of course, I came back to Bengaluru, which is my hometown, and registered for a PhD program once again at IIM Bangalore. Yeah, so some people at IIM Bangalore, of course, quip that I don't get bored of being in the IIMs. Of course, I don't. I'm still in IIM, and I'm very proud of these institutions. But of course, going back, before I joined the PhD program, I also had an interesting civil society opportunity. I was quite an active member of the India Against Corruption movement in Bengaluru, and which was, of course, one of the
Yeah.
important sites for the India Against Corruption
Yes.
movement. And so, as part of, so Anna Hazare ji fasted for 4 days, right? Of course, that's a very, high ask for, but I did fast for one of the days. That was part of the
Wow.
campaign. And so that gave me a window into how civil society movements work, and how to create
Mm.
large movements, and how to kind of maintain that, and so on. But of course, the movement, then there was a political front that was came out of the movement, and we moved out of it. From that, we didn't want to get into the political aspect of it, and then I continued into my PhD journey. PhD journey, of course, we'll talk a little bit more about my research, but I just wanted to end that part of the journey by saying that one of the things behind this was to continue pursuing more work on the Parliament over here. Yeah, thanks.
I'm very intrigued also about the social sector consulting that you were doing at PwC, because I think today the opportunities to work as a social sector consultant with all of these major consulting firms has really increased in terms of the number of opportunities. But I think when you were doing it, which is more than a decade back, uh, it was
Yeah, yeah.
not as common for a MBA to go for social sector consulting. What was the experience like back then for you in the social sector consulting space? And I know you keep interacting with people in the social sector consulting space even today. If you had to also kind of just contrast it with the experience today, what has changed?
Yeah, yes, yeah. So things have changed, right? And the opportunities have expanded enormously since the time, as you rightly said. The time when I was with PwC was between 2007 and 2009. So that was, as you say, quite some time back, and this was a new kind of opportunity. because the government also was kind of opening up to people coming from outside and advising or consulting with them through projects. And yeah, what you said is quite true at that point in time, that we were told that PwC also has a flourishing commercial business consulting and that. So one of the projects was with regard to evaluation of a particular policy program, and this was the midday meal program, and we had to do it since I was based out of Bengaluru. So we had to do it for Karnataka state. And so this was a fascinating project because it involved kind of conducting a survey of roughly in Karnataka, as in many other states. I mean, there are about 40, 50,000 schools. So conducting a survey of 40,000 schools, a sample survey. So that still involved about 2 or 3,000 schools that we had to sample. So we had to kind of bring in a proper sample methodology, use surveys, recruit survey agencies, and then of course also go on to the field. So for me, that was a great field experience because I got to travel across about 16 or 17 districts across Karnataka state, and then talk to people across different sections of society. So I just wanted to highlight that some of these projects, consultancy projects, usually, the perception of consultancy projects is that, you sit in, the comfort of your AC rooms, and then you churn out data and try to make recommendations. That is not true in all the cases. There's a large amount of field work also involved pursuant to doing the data work. And so this was an important experience in the social sector consulting.
Professor, I think going further, another thing that I would like love to talk about in your career journey is you have done your research interests lie in democracy and parliament and legislature, and you've even authored two papers on disruptions in parliament. How do you think the year or two that you spent as a fellow in the parliament helped you pursue that research interest or develop that research interest for which you also ended up doing a PhD in the same subject?
Yeah. So, I mean, as a researcher, it's always, a researcher, of course, works on scientific evidence and things like that. But what you research on is something usually that's troubling you somewhere, right? Some problem in society and some issue in society that really troubles you, and you feel that you want to know more about it. And so a PhD is a good opportunity to kind of delve into some that subject in some depth. So, I mean, that 1 year in parliament, of course, gave me the huge exposure, right? And this, being in, the precincts of the house for 1 year period is for a young person, right? Mid 20s is, of course, a once in a lifetime experience. So, we got to attend parliamentary sessions for a number of times, right? We got to speak to MPs. In fact, the main project that I did here, which was a research project, was to try and evaluate the overall functioning of the parliament, and there was a certain framework by the interparliamentary union by which you can evaluate parliamentary functioning. And that gave me an opportunity to actually interview 100 members of parliament, and that of course has come out as a publication which is available at the Lok Sabha secretariat. But for me
Wow.
personally, that was very revealing to have an opportunity to interview members of parliament, both inside the house, in their houses, right? Some of them invited me, having lunch with them on the way to the airport, and so whole lot of different such
Yeah.
experiences,
Yeah.
right? But one thing that really struck me was that when I was watching the proceedings of the house, was the increasing incidence of conflict that I saw in the house, right? Which, of course, took the form of disruptions and members of parliament coming onto the floor of the house and shouting slogans and things like that, which, of course, disturbed me a little bit, quite a bit actually, because, we call this as, a sacred temple of democracy, a sacred
Democracy, yeah.
place where democracy is performed. And what is the effect that, for the citizens at large, when people in that important place itself are kind of fighting, exchanging, harsh language and sloganeering and things like that. And so that's what kind of motivated me to go into this field of trying to examine, the incidence of disruption in parliament. And I feel that understanding disruptions is important for two or three reasons, right? Because what happens in parliament, of course, we can look at disruptions in a very, limited sense, that, disruptions harms the productivity of parliament. But you can look at it further, that due to disruptions, there's not enough time spent on discussions of parliamentary bills, which has problems later on if laws are not properly discussed and passed and things like that. But also, I think parliament as a fora is something that is consciously or unconsciously, noticed by people. And it's a signal to people about how do you resolve conflict. So if the, preeminent institution of the country is unable to, demonstrate a civil way of resolving conflict, this is, of course, has, spillover effects on how people outside the parliament behave and how they think about resolving conflict. And so these were the number of factors that really disturbed me. It wasn't nearly about being a parliamentary phenomena, but it's about something that people are viewing day in and day out, and it's sending them messages on how conflict should be resolved, and in this case, how conflict should not be resolved, right? And so that's why, for me, disruption was an important
That's true.
aspect for
But
me.
I think there's another perspective to it. So, for example, a lot of people believe that the reason parliamentary committees are usually more cooperative and they discuss more intellectually and in a more cordial manner is because they are closed door and they are not visible to the public. And a lot of people opine that televisation of parliament proceedings and parliament debates has led to more dramatic effect to the proceedings of the parliament. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so it's interesting. I don't know if it's coincidence or what, but this is a paper that I'm currently on, and that we'll be sending out for publication in a few weeks or so. And this is exactly about the subject on whether television has an impact on the functioning of the parliament and on the rising cases of disruption. Of course, what you say is precisely true, because one of the things that television does is television, makes the parliament as a forum for demonstration, or what we call performance, right? So members of parliament are performing their duties on parliament because they have to go back to their constituents and report that, right? But it also depends on how we view it, right? Because, how do you perform, how members of parliament perform is also a function of what people expect from them, right? So we would assume, and one would assume, that in a public fora, people would generally show up good behavior, isn't it? Right? So what are the forces that are driving people
Yeah.
to not show good behavior when they are in the public eye, right? And this is an important aspect, right? So television could have some salutary effects as well, right? Television could, for example, promote members of parliament to prepare better, to give stronger speeches, to give better quality speeches. It could have worked that well as well. So why is it that television is working out to bring out the worst of people and prompt this kind of behavior? And this is, I think, an important part of investigation. And I think I'm very happy that, you brought out this discussion on how television has
Yeah,
an impact.
and I'm looking forward to read the paper to know more about your research on that. I think another thing that I would love to know, what does the life of a professor at IIM Indore look like? A week in your life looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I won't say only about me, right? Because when I was in school, our view of people in academia is that, they're almost retired, right? Right? They're doing nothing. They're just sitting in, yeah, they're doing research. Okay, that goes on, but, they speak slowly, and they have a relaxed life. That used to be the perception of us.
Yeah.
Of course, when I went to school, I realized that wasn't so. But I would go on and say that it's increasingly changed, right? Even if that there was some kind of room for contemplation and thought and things like that. So we are required to do both, right? So we are required to perform, to be very strong at performance, deliver on paper, on research papers, right? So we have a kind of a long timeline of papers that we have to kind of deliver on. At the same time, we have responsibilities towards students as well. So we have to gear up students, and students are also very particular, and they are also very aware about what to expect from classes and so on. So I think gone are the times when, even I don't know if it really happened, that faculty were relaxed. It's extremely hectic now. And so for example, today, I mean, I have a schedule which goes up till at least about 8 p.m. in the night, right? And so then I kind of go back home, and then of course that we have your familial duties as well. So it's extremely, and we are also extremely ambitious, right? So we are extremely ambitious not only for ourselves, but our ambition is also a product of what we bring out from students, right? So we want our students to succeed in their careers, and we want to see our kind of ambition reflected in their success. And that's a very important part of that, right? So educational institutions today are not only places where one looks at the number of research papers, but increasingly, and I feel educational institutions should also be seen not only from their academic excellence, but also in terms of the number of leaders that they are creating, right? And so we are quite ambitious, yeah.
I think one thing that has not changed, and not changed for good, in terms of perception or what people in academia do, is the rigor they bring to whatever they're doing in research and whatever they're working on. And I think one thing that has even gone a step further is, especially in social sciences for that matter, is the real world application of the research that academia is doing. What's your perspective on, given that you do research on public policy and social sciences, and we see a lot of examples of a lot of academy academia members, professors starting boutique consulting firms or something as big as what we today know as JPAL. What's your perspective on the interaction of the world of academia with the world of public policy?
Yeah, public policy as a field is a very practitioner oriented field, right? And we are trying to use the lens from the core fields, whether it's political science, whether it's economics, whether it's sociology, whether whatever those core subjects are, to solve real life problems. So public policy is in that way. And I feel that any researcher in this field should ideally have two buckets of research that go on. One is, of course, pure academic research, which is where you're trying to build on the world of knowledge in that particular field, right? Which is, of course, it's time consuming, and you need a lot of contemplation because you're contributing to the field of knowledge. In my case, my work on legislatures is that field where I'm trying to contribute to this field of knowledge about the functioning of the legislatures, and primarily bringing light to the functioning of the Indian legislature, right, which has hardly been kind of explored in the field of legislatures. It's almost like we are in this field, right, where there's hardly any academic scholars on the Indian legislature, right? We have a lot of distinguished commentators, we have distinguished practitioners in this field, but we hardly have any academic scholars in that field. And that's a field that I am looking forward to kind of moving in, and at least help kind of fill up that space. But alongside that, we have our own lives along with students, and students come up with various sorts of their aspirations and their questions. They want to know some of the questions that you're asking, right? About what is social sector consulting, what is this about political consulting, what's happening in that space, what is happening in the space of public policy consulting, what's happening in the space of impact investing consulting, and so on. And so that's also picks our interest in some of these new fields, right? And so in response to some of these interests, and so I say that, I have a few papers that are practical and dedicated to my students, right? So there's one paper that I have on political consulting, right, which where we interviewed about 15 or 16 political consultants and published this, paper, which of course is being fairly discussed. In fact, just last week, I was at a university, as part of a core group of the plan of the university to set up an institute for training politicians, professional
Oh,
politicians.
wow.
Right? And one of the base documents that was being discussed in that gathering was this paper on political consulting, right? So similarly, public policy education, right? People didn't know much about, the space, and through our own research on this field, we were able to track and identify 56 institutions in the country that provide public policy education, and try and understand, okay, what's happening, what is the conversation in these fields, right? Where are these institutions located? What is the kinds of coursework that they provide, right? What are the kinds of challenges that the management face? In fact, a central question that is plaguing a large number of institutions is that, what do you mean by public policy education in India, right? Does it mean that does it public policy education in India mean that I take the curriculum from a Harvard or, another distinguished institution and just replicate the same thing in India? Or do we have certain important contextual differences for the context of India by that we incorporate in our public policy curriculum? Do we incorporate, field courses in the policy curriculum, and so on? And so there's a large amount of discussion. And then a big thing that, many people in public policy, the India group, are also worried about is, what are the kinds of, employment opportunities that are available over there? And so we were able to discuss this with, a diversity of stakeholders, and bring some important contributions to that space. Now, of course, we are doing another paper on the impact investing space, where we have interviewed about 15 people in the space, and we look forward to putting that out as a publication
I
as well.
think I would love to ask a few questions on your research in public policy education in India. I think that's something definitely which has caught the fancy of a lot of people. A decade back, you may hear the words development studies or social sciences, but public policy as a separate field has really emerged in the last decade in India as a separate course or something. And as you were saying, you were able to actually interview 56 institutions, like probably in a matter of 10-15 years, most of them must have started a course in public policy. What's your, after having spoken with these institutions and understood the curriculum, what do you think a public policy degree is giving its graduates overall? It may be from any of the universities in these 56, or like a blend of that. What do you think is a takeaway for a public policy graduate from these
Yeah, so
courses?
this is an important question, and I won't say that there's a very concrete answer to this. Each school is kind of giving its own answer to this. But if you're looking at a generic idea of what a public policy course is, and across the board, you'll find that there's some broad convergence on the fact that a public policy course should have three primary, subjects. So one is, of course, politics, right? The other is economics, and the fourth is organizational studies, right? So these are the three critical arms of a public policy course, right? And within that, of course, there could be different courses on policy specialization. Like somebody may wish to specialize on, technology matters. Somebody may wish to specialize on climate change. Somebody may wish to specialize on various other factors, right? But this would be the core of a public policy program, and around that, a number of other subjects. Of course, one of the things that we found, and this is something that we also, presented at, IIM Ahmedabad, and then we also made a presentation at ISP, and so one of the things that, were looked at is that, in our curriculum, right, the weightage given to ethics was very less, and this was an important element because, you know public policy is very intertwined with with value systems, right? And to have a good understanding of ethics and philosophy, I think those are the subjects
But
where number
do
of
you have a
questions.
perspective on why this is a very interesting one? I am wondering why such a low weightage to ethics when time and again I think that's what public servants and public policy, like people who are carrying forward the mantle of public policy in the country, are usually criticized for lack of like ethical values. And what do you think was like the reason that's not that much
No,
apart?
yeah, I mean, if I have to give, and these are my, immediate reactions. This is a good question that needs to be, thought about further. But I think somewhere it's also, that the lack, since it's a new, since many of these programs are new, right? We still have, that gap between the kind of faculty that is available and the kind of courses that we have. So I
Yeah.
think we need more people who are, because philosophy is studied as a separate subject. It's not studied so much in, in alignment with policy. So we need more faculty who can kind of specialize in that subjects to bring in this as part of the core curriculum. The other is, of course, the, important, discussion on, okay, I mean, when we mean ethic, what is the stream of ethics that we are talking about? So we have different, streams of philosophy. So we have the schools of Western philosophy, you have the schools of Indian philosophy, and at some point in time is how do you kind of blend the strengths of both, so that you also have a universalistic idea of ethics as well as a contextual idea of ethics. So some of these things are important challenges that a public policy education should delve with and create, a good framework to kind of engage with it. Yeah.
I think another question I would love to ask you, and if you think you can comment on, is I think while we say that the MPP degrees and the public policy degrees are in their nascent stages, already there's a sort of debate if they are the right degrees. And of course, usually traditionally people have done, let's say, economics or political science and have been a sort of specialist, while these MPP degrees or development studies degrees are more generalist. So there's a certain section of people who feel if we have to do a generalist degree, let's probably do an MBA which is more entrenched. Or there are certain set of people who are like, oh, if I'm going to choose to work in education or public health or any other field with like a specific domain within public policy, might as well do a master's and specialization in that particular field. So there's a sort of a pull away in these two directions when we see public policy education. Given that you are from one of the premier MBA institutes as well in the country, what's your perspective on this whole MBA versus MPP versus a specialized degree debate that's going on?
This is a good question. I mean, MPP in that sense is meant for generalist kinds of roles, because, the MPP course structure gives you, as I said, economics, politics, and organizational studies, which give you a general understanding of how government works. And, in the consultancy firms that I know of, they generally have two kinds of positions, right? So they have a generalist position where you generally have an understanding of how the, sector works, and then a more specialist where you have in-depth kind of field experience in that particular sector and things like that. But given that the field of public policy consulting is kind of growing very fast, right, I feel that an MBA degree will give a different kind of a perspective to students as compared to an MPP degree if it's done well, right? Because, an MBA degree gears you up for primarily a business career, right? And if you're looking at the organizational structure of businesses, the incentives of businesses, right, the kinds of challenges that they have are very different from the kinds of challenges that governments have, right? So yeah, I mean, just taking it purely from an objective function perspective, right? So the conversation on what is the objective of a business usually ends with, yes, the business needs to make profit, right? For, of course, for long term sustainability of the business, they need to ensure that not only their shareholders are happy, but also the stakeholders are happy. But the objectives of the government are far more complex, right? So, if you are looking at, for example, the earlier example that we took about a midday meal program, right? One may say yes, the one of the objectives is to improve enrollment and thereby attendance of students, but it's also to improve the health care of students. It's also to provide employment to people, who can work as cooks and things like that. So the dimensions by which you look at public policy are much wider. And so your monitoring and evaluation frameworks, your organization studies, working with bureaucracy, right? These all are very, very different. And so this is not only my experience. One of my students who's right now a consultant with BCG, so she tells me the same thing, right? That when I worked with BCG and now I'm working on a government sector project, I would have wished if somebody told me a little bit about the organizational structure of government, by which I could understand, okay, these are the pressures under which the bureaucracy works, and this is what is possible within this organizational structure, and this is what is unrealistic to expect from them. So I think an MPP course will have its own merit. Of course, we have to, number one, get the kinds of students to get into it, which is, of course, increasingly we are.
And I think when you talk about the government structure, I had the wonderful opportunity to do fellowships where I worked with the government, and I also worked with the parliament, but another was with more district level working with the government. And when you were talking about it, I remembered a project where a senior of mine who has been working in the sector for the past 7 8 years says he doesn't understand the government structure. And I was surprised because I'm reporting to him, and we sit down in the hotel lobby, and for half an hour we talk about how the government is, the hierarchy and everything. And that's when I felt very thankful for the early experiences I've had and the good fortune of having worked with the government so closely in these fellowships, which in my opinion are also a bit of learning experience. Somewhere some elements of university education exists in such fellowships. There's been a
True.
proliferation of such fellowships in the recent past. What's your opinion or any experience you've had with such fellowships so far?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we did some training for some of these fellowships, right? And I've also had grade some of my for students as well as interested people too. So this fellowship is a very exciting space, right? So you're just out of college or just completed your post graduation and gone into one of these fellowships. It opens up the world for you, right? I mean, people who do fellowships with these district officers as well as the CM fellowships, I think it's a great and exciting opportunity. The question that of course comes in is that you can do one fellowship, and these days these fellowships also pay quite decently, isn't
Yeah.
don't they? And they have, some of them have accommodation also provided and things like that, and some where, the example that you said is where you can actually see that yourself making change and things like that. So while that aspect and of that is very well taken, right, the question is that, and that's also something that we have highlighted in our policy education paper, is that students come back and say, okay, I've done this fellowship from so and so place, but what should I do after that, right? And many of these fellowships also have, an age limit, right? Usually around 30 years and things like that, right? And so after 30 years, then what do I do,
Yeah.
right? So one of our interviewees used this term fellowship hopping, right? So let's
Yeah.
just like, in younger days, right, one does pub hopping and all that. So
Yeah.
so people at the younger days are doing fellowship hopping, right? They're moving from one fellowship to the other, not for any fault of theirs, but what is the prior and structured career option that is there for
Mm.
public policy. And that is something that we need to, very carefully think about. And that's also something that I am also talking to people in the policy space. In fact, this is what yesterday I was just speaking to one person who's a mid-career professional, right? Somebody who worked with the ministry for one of these contractual positions, but after that he's saying, okay, this is what I want to do, right? I want to do something, for example, on behavioral change, but what should I do to be, able to be under consideration, and what is the kind of structured opportunity? And I had to empathize with him, right? That it's tough, right? It's tough after a certain point if you're in a mid career, right? And of course, if you are in one of the consultancy, or you are in organizations, like the UN and things like that, there are a few more structured positions. But if you are an OSD, for example, to a minister or something like that, once the term of the minister gets over, right, what is it next that is in store, right? There is a little bit of an unstructured. Of course, if you have an entrepreneurial mindset, right, you may still be able to hang on, right? For that, there was a lot of hope for these lateral recruitments, right? And there's
Yeah.
a lot of hope for these lateral recruitments that happened for some time. But I think, there have been some pros and cons that has probably not got on. And still, the common complaint is that the number of positions are still very limited,
Yeah.
right, to offer opportunities across the board. So I think, yeah, I mean, my suggestion to them, to most fellows, is that, yeah, it's a little unstructured. We empathize with you, right? You'll have to kind of hang on. We'll have to form core bonds within us to help each other out, but you hang on. And I'm hoping that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully in the next wave there are going to be better, career opportunities. But I would also use this as a way to caution people who have joined public policy courses. I know I am also somebody who's in that field, and but I think you should also think a little bit more carefully about what are the kinds of career opportunities you are looking at before joining a public policy education course, so that you're not disappointed kind of later on, and your expectations are well set with regard to what is possible and what is not possible. Yeah.
Oh, that's such a valid point. I'm so glad that you brought it up. And while the whole fellowship hopping and then not knowing what to do after the fellowship hopping is over is so saddening in some of the ways to even think of that. But I think that's how any emerging career trajectory looks like, when the space itself is evolving and creating opportunities for itself in a very fast pace, but maybe not fast enough for someone who's already been in the place for 10, 15 years and has, as you're calling it, become a mid-career professional. It's definitely concerning. And I think something I'm also very optimistic that the things change with the way things are already seeming to change. But I think one of the ways, and this gives me a very good segue into what I would want to really talk to you about today as well, is a lot of people then end up pursuing another degree. For some, it's a master's, but for many who are looking for more rigor and more research and are more research oriented as well, it may be a PhD. I have so many friends who have, after spending 7, 8 years, gone on to do a PhD in social sciences, particularly in public policy and related fields. And they're coming out with some wonderful research where they're partnering with the governments now because the field has developed. I have a friend who's working with the Government of India Commission while sitting in Yale, working on capacity building of bureaucrats. So I think I would love for you to also tell us a little more about what and what path lies for someone who decides to pursue a PhD in social sciences, especially for someone who has maybe worked in the public, who has been a practitioner in the public policy and development studies space for a while before he or she comes for the PhD degree.
Yeah. So I think it's good. I think we need a lot more professionals who have experience the ground, experience the field of public policy. And the problem that they are looking at is an angst that they have, right? So it's emotions that kind of drive you to look into a problem, and so that helps you to be relentless with the problem, right? Relentless in trying to get a better understanding of the problem, and that also helps in your own kind of intellectual development, right? So I really respect people who have a good amount of experience, right? Because I've also seen researchers, right, who are so number driven, right? So I have seen papers from researchers, right, who have published in very good journals, and these are papers on education. But when I look at the researcher, right, the researcher would not have even gone to a government school in India, right? So your paper is making recommendations based on government statistics on what the government school should do in India, but you have no personal experience of what a school is, right? So I would, if from that point of view, which I mean, I feel this is kind of problematic. So from that point of view, I really encourage the practitioners who have some kind of inkling of what the field looks like to kind of endeavor to do policy research, right? As you say, of course, PhD seems to be one of the good pathways. Of course, there is policy research other than the PhDs also. There are lots of practitioners who do policy research and who come out with practical suggestions for kind of improving things. We have number of kind of think tanks and other organizations that also kind of employ people who may not have a PhD, right? But of course, if you have the thirst for going into a little bit more of depth into certain fields, the PhD of course gives you that opportunity for intellectual fulfillment and knowing more about this field. And of course, there are a large number of policy PhD opportunities. One is, of course, if you want to get into a social science field like a sociology, political science, and things like that. That is one aspect. But you can also look for public policy PhDs, and of course, across the world, there are very good universities that provide public policy PhDs. Of course, I'll talk a little bit more about the public policy PhDs available in India, because once again, this is a field that has grown in significantly over the last 10 years. And of course, you have public policy PhDs provide within in the IIM system. Like if you're looking at the top 6 IIMs, then I would say Ahmedabad, Bangalore, Calcutta, and Indore, we all provide public policy kind of PhDs. Of course, at IIM Indore, we don't have a public policy area or center like we may have in some of the others, but we have a humanities and social sciences area which recognizes the interdisciplinary kind of aspect attribute of public policy. And so you have a large number of opportunities of doing a public policy research at IIM Indore as well. Of course, the important kind of question is about, okay, if you want to look for a PhD, right, what kind of institution should you look at? Should you look at doing a PhD outside, or should you look at doing a PhD in India? So I think they are both pros and cons, and this is how I describe it to most people, right? One is, of course, a PhD outside. The theory of public policy is fairly developed outside India, and you have a variety of public policy specialization available outside India, which are still developing in India, right? So one of the things that we also learned in the public policy education paper is that, yeah, while public policy education as a broad field, as a generalist field, has evolved, specialist in, suppose I want to do something in environmental policy, suppose I want to do something in technology policy, suppose I want to do something in some other field, rural development and those things. So specialist policy specializations have yet to develop
Yeah.
to that extent.
Mm.
So that of course, doing a public policy PhD outside will give a little edge. But of
Yeah.
course, I'm mindful that things have also changed in the last 10 years. So we have faculty in India itself who are ambitious, and of course, publishing in some of the top journals outside, right? For example, I can imagine my own studies, right, on the legislature, right, prior to my publishing a paper in one of the top journals of legislature, that's the Journal of Legislative Studies. There were probably two or three other publications that came from India, right? So even last year, when I attended the top political science conference, the American Political Science Association, there was only one other presenter from India who went to that conference. perils, right? So we are in that space. We are, there's a lot of glass ceilings to break over here in that space. So we are moving very swiftly in that regard. But I also want to give a plus with regard to pursuing a public policy in India. One of the things is that, a PhD, right? You would have done your fellowships, you would have done your master's courses in public policy, but PhD at the end of the day is the most impressionable years of somebody in the public policy field, right? So for me, it's also, while I had done, social part of social movements, done my work in parliament, done my work in a consultancy, the kind of 4 or 5 or 5.5 years exposure that you get in PhD, and the kind of worldview that it develops, yeah, you get to question some of your, assumed theories, right, which you may have learned in your consultancy, or, in the other fields, right? And so in those impressionable years, right, it is useful to be in the context of your study later on, right? So one of the questions that obviously comes in, and some, people who do, masters programs in public policy in other institutions, right, they often question that, the case studies that we learn, right, are hardly from India, are hardly from the global south, if I take in general, but they're hardly from India. So I'm doing a case study on some country in Europe or some country in the US, and I'm using a particular framework, but how is that useful to enhance my imagination of what's happening in India? So if
Yeah.
you're looking at contextual knowledge, if you're looking at, field oriented knowledge, that is something that, being in India during your most impressionable years, would give you a better sense. And I think, policy researcher is a very different researcher from the other fields, right? A policy researcher, it's a far more demanding space, right? So you need to know the local culture, the local language. I think every policy researcher, for example, in India, should know at least three languages, right? The official languages in India, that is English and Hindi, but you should also know a local language in your place, right? In the place that you are kind of operating in. So these are the kinds of opportunities that being in India give you, which if you're outside may not give you that space. And it's important to cultivate this, right? A policy researcher is grows as an individual, right? Grows as an individual, not only grows with the papers they write. So I think this is the other aspect that I wanted to highlight with regard to doing a PhD outside world.
I think they are also a huge incentive to pursue a PhD in India while you plan to do your field work in the subject you choose in India itself. So I think, yeah, I definitely agree. But Professor, I think another thing for people who may not have had a research background before, or may have not done a master's in social sciences or public policy, or maybe let's say done an MTech, and now after working in the space for a few years want to pursue a degree, what would you say if they want to research a little more on how do you go about a PhD? What else do they have to know about PhD? If you would have any resources to suggest for such people to like do their own research a little more about what PhD entails, what
Yeah.
if you have any suggestions?
Yeah, so one of the ways is, of course, there's nothing better than a hands-on approach in some of these things. So, my suggestion to them is that contact a faculty, right? Contact a faculty that you would like to.
I see a lot of DMs coming to you in the coming future, but okay. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, no, I mean, contact a faculty that you like. So,
Yeah.
you know, yeah. So contact a faculty that, and if there is a, of course, I would, make it contingent on, mutual interest, right? So,
Yeah.
the faculty that you work with also has a narrow bandwidth around which they can work on certain projects, right? But feel free to contact people that you like. These days, I think there are some pre-doctoral fellowships also available, right? For example, IIM Bangalore has a pre-doctoral kind of fellowship opportunity, as well as there are good opportunities to work as academic associates with faculty. For example, I have an academic associate working with me who's interested to do a PhD, right, going forward. But the former academic associate who was working with me is now pursuing his PhD in public policy at IIM Bangalore.
They are paid well as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So PhDs at the IIMs are fairly well paid, right? So even over here, right? Of course, you will see the advertisements about what's the kinds of compensation that Indore as well provides. But the compensation that is kind of provided excludes the free. I will not say free. I will say the accommodation that is given, right, as well as the food that is given. So this excludes those aspects, and so this is something that you would get in hand, right? So this, and it's a fairly, so we have, we of course we have very stringent norms with regarding to how we select students.
Yeah.
So most of our students already have a kind of a JRF kind of a qualification, or they have taken the CAT or the GMAT and other examinations, and got a good score. So it's demanding, of course, to get in. But once you do, I think a lot of these things are kind of taken care of. And I can say with confidence, because I was myself a PhD student from IIM Bangalore, right? It's tough. Yeah, of course, you can imagine, right? It does, PhD does take a few years of your life, some pay cuts and things like that. But yeah, these are some of the things that we have to think about, so that you can have a look for a bright future. Yeah, yeah.
Hmm. And looking back at your own academic career, what do you think is that one initial mistake you may have done, or something you would have done differently if you had to redo or restart? And what's that and why?
Okay, that may be, yeah, that may be, there are kinds of, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. And yeah, sometimes, yeah, working with a faculty before you do your PhD, right, prepares you with what you can expect from a PhD, right? And that is something that I kind of could have done with. I could have worked with the faculty for some time before taking up the PhD, because it took some time for me, to get into the groove and get my expectations right
Yeah.
of what a PhD can kind of involve, right? Because prior to that, when you're a practitioner, your life cycle of a project is much reduced, right? And I can see that with some of the people that I'm kind of collaborating with who work with consultancy firms, right? So they are looking at a life cycle of 6 months, and I'm telling of them about projects that I started 2 years back and are still right now completed. So we
Yeah.
have very different life cycle
Yeah.
expectations. So I think that it would be useful to take up short research projects, because the number one quality of a good PhD candidate is, of course, intellectual capability and other things are important, but the number one quality is persistence, right? The ability to persist, the ability to kind of accept that you are going to work on one project for 4 or 5 years, which is not something easy to accept. You're going to work on one
Yeah.
topic, right, for 4 or 5 years,
Yeah.
right? And it's like, I mean, if you take an analogy from the medical field, right? So you're an eye doctor. Within an eye doctor also, you're a specialist in cataract,
Yeah.
right? So I'm in that sense, it took a long time for me to realize that I'm a specialist in the legislature, and within the legislature I'm a specialist in conflict in the legislature, right? Which is a very minor field if you look at that. But sometimes you feel that the more you get focused, the more your vision expands, right? If I go back to that story of in the Mahabharata of Dronacharya and Arjuna, where Dronacharya is asking the Pandavas and the Kauravas to focus on the eye of the bird, right? Because if you can see the eye of the bird, you can probably see the bird, right? So similarly over here, if you can see the mind, that one topic, that sharpen your focus, then you can probably
Yeah.
see the world around it. So the
Yeah.
sharpening of the mind is a very important part of the PhD process, and that takes a little time to kind of absorb as you move in. Yeah.
That's very prudent advice. And the last segment, I don't want to leave this one subject that I'm also very intrigued about and is a very up and coming thing, which you are doing your research in. Impact investing. I think so many people are starting to talk about impact investing, and we, in the initial part of the conversation, we talked about the remuneration and we talked about how impact is seen. I think from that perspective, I think impact investing may change a lot of things, even in terms of how this is seen as a career. Could you tell us a little bit more about your paper and your reflections and understanding, and what have you been able to learn about impact investing until now?
Yeah. So I mean, so this is still in process. So there's a lot that hopefully will come out. Yeah, but one of the things that we are realizing about the impact investing space is that the space has grown, exponentially in India, right? And so much so there's also a Harvard Business School study on impact investing, right, which does a cross country comparison of impact investing, and India is number 4 in the number of
Oh,
impact
wow.
investors. Yeah. And we have grown very fast, while across the world this field has grown post the 1990s, right? In India, if you're looking at the timeline of the impact investors, it's basically 2005 onwards that this field has kind of grown, right? So we started late but grew also much faster, so that we are becoming the number 4 in the number of impact investors, right? So that is of course one thing, but we are also seeing that there is a growing diversification in terms of the sectoral distribution, and certain both innovations from the impact investors as well as policy enablers have kind of both kind of influenced the growth as well as the spread of the space. For example, the financial inclusion has been really facilitated by good kind of policy measures, where investors who tie up with social entrepreneurs enterprises feel more secure that the beneficiaries are receiving the impact and so on. So, and of course, policy measures in terms of the current discussion on the social stock exchange, right, which is also a kind of an interesting facilitator for the
Yeah.
impact investing space. But also some interesting and powerful innovations that the impact investors have really taken, right, in terms of the stage of investment. Early on, impact investors were looking only at the early stage investment, but now they are also looking at the growth stages and other stages, so to enable sustainability and things like that. So that space has kind of grown a lot in India, compared to the global space, and that's why it's a very exciting space to come in. But it's also exciting because there's a lot of funding available,
Yeah.
right? If you're looking at the ESG norms that are working for global companies, as well as the rising tide of development finance that is coming in, right? So initially you had some of these foundations which said that, yeah, we'll invest in NGOs, right? But now they are saying that the same foundations have the sense that impact investors are not only delivering efficiency but also effectiveness. And so some of these funds as well, philanthropic funds, also are channelizing. So you're kind of having an accretion in the amounts of funding that's also available in the impact investing space. That of course doesn't mean that we need not be careful about the space,
Yeah.
right? There's a lot of what you call is impact washing that's kind of happening, right? We need strong measurement strategies, which we are still far away globally, and of course in the context of India. How do you measure the impact of
Yeah.
education? How do you measure the impact of healthcare? How do you measure the impact of financial inclusion and climate and things like that? So there's a large amount of work that has to be done, and where academicians also kind of need to play a role. But I think from a much longer perspective, if you're there's also a potential blurring of the lines that you're seeing between the role of the government and the role of the business, right? As government is trying to adopt some of the efficiency norms that businesses are also being prompted to kind of adopt some of the social responsibility norms that the government, that was earlier thought to be, right? That the sole role of business is to earn profit. But now they're realizing a little bit that for their own interest, as well as for the interest of the society at large, right, they also need to pull up their sleeves and start working on creating and showcasing important kind of impact. Because if they don't do so, right, then government only works in a cut and dry method, and one day they will bring up a rule saying that you will have to give up 3% or 4% of your profits, and
Yeah.
that will hit the business also in a very hard way. So
Yeah.
businesses also need to kind of premeditate some of these things and try to work so that the worst don't come to them when they are least prepared to work on them.
Yeah.
So I think there's a growing consciousness, and this is also motivated by the growing consciousness among our students, among people like you, who feel that, okay, I want a job which will kind of give me some kind of a lifestyle to go in, but also a job that will help me create impact. Right? So for example, one of my students here, and he took up and he's part of this project in an impact investing, and under, I think, this young leaders program of ISB, right? So he applied for the program and he was shortlisted for the interview, and this is what he said there, that this is the kind of prospect that I'm looking at business that not only leads to market returns but also looks
Social
at
media.
impact.
Yeah.
And he was appreciated for his focus, and he was selected, right? Just a few days back, he sent me a message that yes, I was selected for the program. That
Wow.
also recognizes that business schools, businesses, they're also recognizing that this is the world ahead, and we
Yeah.
need to kind of get up for that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the things that you mentioned has been a sort of conversation for a long time, even outside impact investing, is the measurement of impact. I think that's something that's more in focus when it comes to something like impact investing. But I think for even grants that were being given to NGOs and consulting firms, just the measurement of the impact you've been able to achieve, which is a very tricky business because there are not a lot of quantitative figures, and sometimes chasing quantitative figures leads to some certain problems and whatever, has been always a growing debate. And even with the CSR funds, which are looking for those numbers to present to the board versus they saying acha ye humne kar liya hai, and there's a long term impact also which sometimes the like corporates can't understand. What's your perspective on this whole qualitative measurement versus quantitative measurement when it comes to measurement of impact, and just the way forward from whatever you have been,
Yeah.
however you have been looking at it?
No, no, that's true. I mean, I'm predominantly a quantitative, researcher, and there's a course on research methodology that I teach on quantitative. But of course, we have, I say, an unhealthy respect with qualitative researchers. Yeah, but we do realize that there is a benefit in using what we call triangulation. Triangulation is that you understand, you try and bring the quality findings out and the qualitative findings out, and you try to understand to what extent do these two findings really match, right? So there are two three different kinds of mixed method research that you can do with qualitative and quantitative. But even in terms of the quantitative methods that one uses, there are two questions about impact. One is the breadth of impact, and one is the depth of impact. So the breadth of impact is, okay, how many people have I impacted, right? Have I impacted 1,000 people or 10,000 people, right? So that's the breadth of impact, but it's also the depth of impact. Okay, to what extent have I impacted each person? So whatever one measures, yeah, one's measures. And of course, quantitative has the benefit that in a quantitative methodology, you are able to cover a larger expanse of people, you are able to claim representativeness of the sample, and so on. So that's the benefit in terms of the methodological perspective. But if you really want to understand, okay, the subjective evaluation of what things have happened, right, quantitative measures may be limited, but qualitative measures will add to the subjective understanding of what is the benefit that the impact has kind of caused. But we are still very far away, right, in terms of measuring impact. And while I would encourage that we need more impact investing, we need companies to at least put in the effort to, okay, say, okay, I am measuring this impact, right? If I am a soap manufacturer company, am I measuring the impact on sanitation, right? Am I actually measuring the impact on these things? We need at least a push, a prod for them to start doing that. And alongside that, the measures for others would come about, right? If I recall, a researcher on the financial accounting space says that it took close to a century to reach the financial accounting norms, right? So give us time, right, to work on what should be the right measures to look at impact. And we should be able to arrive at something decent over the next decade or so.
I have thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with you today. I think we went beyond what was the planned amount of time we were supposed to speak for, simply because of how much I think I was taking away personally, but also I'm sure our audience is going to take away from these conversations. I can almost see these conversations we've had on different subjects as mini master classes, from public policy education in India to a PhD degree to just general status of policy education to talking about disruption in parliament, which was very fascinating. And I still look forward to read the paper that you come out with. I'm so thankful for you for the conversation today. Thank you so much. Before we go, I'll also ask you any recommendation you may have for our audience, a book or a podcast that you really enjoy or have enjoyed in the recent past or much before, uh, that you would like to recommend.
Yeah, so I have come fairly well prepared for that question. The podcasts, of course, there are many, right?
Yeah.
And policy research is in a space that somewhere policy researchers, they have some kind of a value bent, right? So if so, there are a whole variety of different podcasts depending on what kind of an ideology one kind of pursues
Yeah.
and things. So if you can just wait and hold back, I'll pick up the books from behind. So yeah, so I'll just highlight a few of them, and of course I can put. So this is an interesting book, right? Agents of Change, right? Which talk about how do you kind of bring in change in complex organizations, right? And this is a fascinating book which gives you interesting aspects about theory of change and things like that. Then there is this book on understanding public leadership, right, which again talks about, this is faculty from Harvard, right, who talks about understanding public leadership and what are the kinds of strategies that one uses if one wants to make change in that. But there's a large number of rising number of books on public policy making in India. Yeah, so let me highlight some of the good ones that I found. So this is Public Policy from a View from the Global South, right? From Vishal Narayanji. He's a faculty at MDI. And this is a fascinating overview of the public policy space. Then there is an interesting old book, which I think is not very well available nowadays, which is called Public Policy Making in India by Vaidyanatha Iyengar. He was, I think, also a visiting faculty professor at IIM Bangalore for some time. Fascinating books, which looks at some of the global frameworks and how that may be contextually relevant. Right? There's a new fun book, right, by Pranay Kotasthani. This you may be aware of, right? It's he's a faculty at Takshashila at Bengaluru.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this is a fun book. Yeah, it's and it gives you a good nice overview of the public policy space. I'd recommended this to one of my students who wants to get into the public policy space and things like that. Little bit more involved books on public policy. Of course, there's this book on
Yeah, I've
public
read this one.
institutions
Yeah.
in India. So they have two this thing. One, this is the older book, I think, and then they have a newer book that is Devesh Kapoor and Pratap Bhanu Mehta. This thing, and there are some other books. Of course, this is Professor Sudha Pai edited volume. on constitution and democracy. I've contributed a chapter to this as
Oh,
well.
wow.
Yeah. So this is a chapter on parliament and things. So there's a, yeah, there's a lot more. Obviously, I've
Thanks.
not.
Thank you so much. I think this was a good introduction to a lot of books. Since it's a new year, people can just start picking up these books for their to read for the year. Thank you so much. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. So it
and
was a pleasure, and once again, I'm really happy by the kinds of initiatives that you are all taking, and it's great to see this vibrant space. And yeah, I would welcome, public policy aspirants when they are at Indore to please write to me, and we can plan a meeting sometime.
thank you so
Yeah.
much, Professor Fadnis. Thank you so much for watching Policy Pod. I hope you liked our latest episode. To get regular updates about Policy Pod and other episodes on Public Policy India, please do subscribe to this channel. A big shout out to Gaurav and Yash, without whom this Policy Pod would not be possible. Uh, in case you have any suggestions for us or any comments for us, there's a link in the description below where you can give your suggestions. Thank you so much for tuning in.